Hi. In the introduction to this course, I mentioned that at times I'll be providing addenda to different modules or lectures when material was pointed out to me to be either a little unclear or if it could use a few examples to help flesh things out. Now this particular addendum is to Module 10 and Lecture 1, in particular the material in that module talking about necessary and sufficient conditions. And in that module itself, I started off by giving an example. It turns out the example wasn't actually true, so it was not going to be a great example to follow through the whole discussion of necessary and sufficient conditions, so I abandoned the example in favor of discussing it abstractly, which, while technically accurate, was not necessarily the clearest thing I could have done. So this addendum is designed to provide an example to work through the logic of necessary and sufficient conditions, and therefore hopefully be helpful to you in understanding these concepts. So we're going to start opposite to what we did in the module here and discuss first necessary conditions, which are the sort of more confusing one logically, but maybe the more, maybe not so confusing sort of intuitively rather. Okay. A necessary condition is one that must occur for the event you care about to happen. If it does not occur, the event cannot happen. It is absolutely necessary for the event to happen. Necessity in logical terms is not one of those, the exception that proves the rule type of deals. A necessary condition has to happen for the other thing to happen. If it does not happen, the other thing cannot happen. There are no exceptions. So how do we write that? And here's where the tricky part of logic comes in. We discussed it at length in the module itself. A is necessary for B to happen if B implies A. Remember, this thing over here is an implication. The equals with an arrow points in the direction of the implication. So here, B is implying A. A necessary condition, A is necessary for B to happen if B implies A. That was the weird part we talked about and discussed it at some length. The reason for that is that if B implies A, whenever B happens, A also happens. Therefore, A is necessary for B in the sense that you never see B without also seeing A. Right? You can't see B without seeing A because whenever B happens, A happens. And therefore, A is necessary for B because B can happen without A. So that was the discussion we talked about there in the abstract. What's a concrete example for this? Well, let's say we have two events here. We have winning an election, and we have entering as a candidate. It is necessary to win the election to have entered as a candidate. So if B is winning the election, right? So this is B. And if A is entering as a candidate, then B implies A. Winning the election implies that you entered earlier as a candidate. No, this isn't necessarily a temporal causal chain. This is a logical chain. If I won the election, then I must have earlier entered as a candidate. It is necessary for me to have won the election to have entered as a candidate. That's a necessary condition. Note, though, it is not sufficient. What's sufficient? A sufficient condition is one that is enough to cause something to happen, but doesn't necessarily always have to happen to cause it to happen. So for instance, if A is sufficient to cause B, then if A happens, B happens. That's why we say A implies B. If A happens, then B happens. A causes B, A is sufficient for B to happen. A is a sufficient condition for B to happen. Note, in our example here, A is not sufficient to cause B. Entering an election is not enough to win the election, right? You might still lose, right? So in this case, even though A is a necessary condition for B to happen, A is not a sufficient condition for B to happen. It's not enough, right? A necessary condition doesn't necessarily mean that you get the outcome that you're looking at here. A doesn't necessarily lead to B all the time. It is the component that's needed to get to B. A sufficient condition is enough. If you have sufficient condition, you get A, you get B. What would a sufficient condition be in this case? Well, if you're in a democracy and you have a fair election and it's a first past the post, plurality rule type of election, and you get most votes, that is typically enough to win an election, ignoring electoral college issues, whatever. That's typically enough to win the election. So that A would be a sufficient condition that would produce the B of winning the election. So that's necessary and sufficient with an example, and hopefully that clarifies a little bit the stuff we talked about in the module itself, unnecessary and sufficient conditions. I hope that was helpful. Thank you very much.